All right, today we are going to be looking at the Articles of Confederation. This is our last day of material before we get ready for our test. So please make sure that you are following along and taking notes as you see fit. Our past question, why did America want to separate from Britain? So go back a couple days. Uh, we looked at the different types of colonies that America had, and then we looked at some of the things that Britain did that really we didn't like. So kind of remind yourself of some of those things that happened. Our present question, we already looked at something called the Confederation, and this is called the Articles of Confederation. So let's see if you can remember and see what that Confederation is. If you can't, I would recommend you going back and looking at that because that will be very useful in helping understand what these Articles of Confederation are all about, which is separate powers for each state and very loose power for the whole federal government. Okay, Articles of Confederation definitely gets a bad rap. It's always kind of blamed for this and that thing, and rightly so. There had plenty of issues, but it wasn't all bad. As we will see today, there are some good things that came from this as well. Let's go ahead and start with your prayer. As always, I'll go ahead and let you pause here if you want to continue your prayer. Otherwise, we'll keep on going on. So our objectives today, what we're trying to cover. Number one, how were the Articles of Confederation created? And then what kind of weaknesses do we see from them? And what strengths do we find as well? Though there's definitely quite a laundry list. There's actually 6 different weaknesses that we're going to look at today and see how that came from it. So over here is the actual document. That's the cover of the Articles of Confederation. And we're not going to look at the actual articles today, but we're going to look and see some of the things they had problems with. So how did they make the articles? Remember that during the Second Continental Congress, they're most famous for drafting the Declaration of Independence. That's the big one, right? That's what everybody remembers. And because the articles failed, nobody was like, oh, then the articles too, right? They needed some type of government. They needed some way to control the states, some way to manage the states while the war is going on. And so they drafted the Articles of Confederation. 2 big things during this time. They are focusing on states' rights. They're focusing on allowing each state to have its own control, to have its own army, to have its own power. And that's why what makes it a confederation is the states' powers, the states' rights. The other big thing is the idea of a unicameral. Unicameral is big in Nebraska because it's something that we are very unique about, but it's not very common across the United States. In fact, we're the only state that has a unicameral, a one-house legislature. They did end up passing it. It did take a while because you had to ratify it through all the different random states, and it took a while to do that. So finally it was ratified. Only at the very end of the war did it finally officially get ratified, though they used it throughout the war in order to maintain things they needed to do. Through this making of the articles, they came across a few issues that we're going to touch on today and that are going to be looked at and fixed in future parts and future things in the Constitution. So we're going to make sure we understand the problems here so that we can see how we fix them later down the road. So the first problem, lacking federal money. Okay, as much as we hate taxes, as much as we really bugs us to take money out of our paycheck, the fact that it happens is very important. As we saw earlier, what the federal government uses that money for is very important. And so when the part of the Articles of Confederation, the federal government could not tax the different states. It could request money from the states, but let's be honest, if the federal government asked you for money, are you going to give it to them? Probably not. And because that money didn't come in, they never paid off their war debts, which means that the federal government instantly started off in debt and in a lot of trouble. And there was no common currency. Technically, the federal government had the right to create a currency, but it was not the only currency. Every state had their own currency. In fact, sometimes several types of currencies. And so without one common currency, without one common bank, without one common type of tax system, it's going to be very difficult to really tie these different states together. So first off, money. Money issues always number one top on the list, right? It's like one of the main reasons why people get divorced is money issues. So this whole of lacking federal money, this is a big issue. Another one, no permanent federal military. If you wanted a military, you had to ask for volunteers from the states, and those states would come and join the military. The problem is that they weren't around. Most people didn't want to pay for a permanent military. And under the British, they didn't have to worry about it because they had the British military to look after them and then, again, eventually fight them. So they depended on volunteers from the States. They didn't get many, and they didn't have enough to protect their ships. They didn't have the weapons to guard themselves, their borders. And after the war, the British are just going to stay in a lot of their forts, and nobody's going to push them out because nobody was fighting them. There's also something called Shays' Rebellion, when a whole bunch of farmers essentially revolted against the United States. I think it was in Pennsylvania, and nobody was there to put them down for several days. They just literally could do whatever the heck they wanted. And so it shows no order, no structure, no way to protect people who need that protection. So our third issue is the dealing with interstate trade disputes. Okay? Because each state is independent, only vaguely working with other states, technically there was no trade regulation with other countries and no trade regulation within the states themselves, between the states. So it didn't say how you could deal with other countries. If you're trying to trade with England, do you allow them all to trade with England? Do some states say, no, I'm not going to allow you to trade with England? What are the different rates of coming in? And then, of course, tariff wars. So remember that a tariff is a tax on imported goods. Well, they would have tariffs between. If you would try to go from Nebraska to Iowa, you may have to pay a tariff in order to cross that border with your goods. Okay? And that seems kind of ridiculous within its own nation, within its own country. If you're trying to work together, that doesn't work very well. So people started to having lots of issues with interstate trade and outer-state trade as well. Our fourth one is something called a supermajority vote. So the fact that if you're in Congress today, in order to vote for something and get it passed, you need a 51%, just a simple majority. But a supermajority means that you're going to need more than that most basic majority idea. If you wanted to do a simple majority out of 13, you would only need to have 7, right? That's just 1 over half. But they needed 9 out of 13 to pass any law, which is very close to that 2/3 vote, right? It's very, very close to that 2/3 vote. So that means if you want 2/3 of anybody to agree to pass any law, you're not going to pass any laws, which is kind of what they wanted. They actually wanted that. They wanted a few laws so that way fewer things were happening. And if you wanted to pass any amendment, everyone had to agree. Now, the other thing that really threw people is that every single state had just 1 vote. Okay, so whether you are Virginia or New York and has lots of population, or whether you're Rhode Island, you each had 1 vote as a state. No matter how big, how small you were, no matter how powerful you were, no matter what. And so that is going to upset a lot of people, as we'll see later. So they had to figure out a better way to balance that in the future. The fifth one, no executive power, no president, no agencies, no way to enforce the law. And so technically Congress would make laws and they'd be like, all right, and just totally ignore them, right? As they're saying, I'm starting to wonder how bad 4 years without a president would be. Well, it would be pretty bad. Without any executive who enforces the rules, there can be chaos, and there was chaos. Some states would enforce the laws, other states would enforce the laws. The president and his agencies are there to make sure the laws are being followed as they should be. And that's the whole point of having an executive. And our last thing is the courts. Without any national courts, there's no way for them to figure out how to work together. The state borders, they're not as concrete as they are today, right? Sometimes there's a little wiggle room as they're like, oh, well, this is actually belonging to Maryland. No, it's actually belonging to Virginia. No, it's actually belonging to New Jersey, okay? And instead, they couldn't take this to the courts because there were no federal courts. Instead, there was Congress, a unicameral Congress. And if you wanted to bring it to them, then they would decide the factor for you. But once again, even that, they had so much on their plates, there's no way they could get to all these different disputes. Plus, the citizens, if they're from different states, they also couldn't solve disputes because a citizen from Nebraska versus a citizen from Iowa, they have different laws, they have different ideas, and they're enforced differently. And so it led to a lot of court issues and how to deal with justice and how to deal with laws and how to deal with breaking those laws. So that is our last weakness. So money, trade, federal, military, no executive, no courts, and supermajority vote. Those 6 things are going to lead to the United States looking at, we need to create a better, more structured government, something that's going to be a little bit easier to use. It was a great first attempt. And once again, it wasn't all bad. There were some good things that happened. You don't have to write these down as part of remembering for the test, but you definitely can understand how these are good things. Number one, we needed a government during the Revolutionary War. We needed some way to create order and structure during the Revolutionary War. It did that. And then after the war was done, they're going to sign a peace treaty that is going to allow them to have their independence. That was through this federal government. They were able to create a peace treaty that created their independence. So whether we like it or not, it is our first government, the Articles of Confederation, not the Constitution. Okay? And the last thing that is going to be really the only law that was really passed that really made any difference whatsoever is something called the Northwest Ordinance. So in this area over here, we got all this land from England, but we didn't have states over there. We didn't have anything, we didn't know what to do. There's a lot of people who are worried that these states would continue to grow onto additional states. So Pennsylvania would just keep on growing farther and farther west, or, the Virginia would do that, or Carolinas would do that, whatever. Okay? And so they decided to set it up so that way they become future states. So within each state, they created 5 different states, and then within each of those 5 states, they're going to create different blocks, and within each block they're going to break those blocks into smaller sections, and so each one is going to have a certain number of acres, and allowed for people to purchase that, and that got the government money. It really did set up quite well, and something that we continue to use even under the new Constitution. So at least a couple good things that happened from these articles that worked out quite well. So what we're going to look at is in the next unit, so this is the end of this first unit, we're going to look in the next unit and see how they're going to fix a lot of these problems. But first, let's go ahead and do a little activity for tomorrow. So your goal is to create a realistic, hypothetical story about one of the articles. So it doesn't have to be real, but it should seem real. Come up with a headline, write about 4 to 6 sentences, and then make sure you understand which type of weakness it ties to. So I created an example here that you can follow through with. So all but one. I have a little date there. So close. This past week, the representatives from various states met in New York to discuss an amendment to the Articles of Confederation. They wanted to include the right to vote for all women citizens in the United States. As you know, women have been underrepresented and suppressed for most of history. We had the chance to change all that with this new amendment. All states voted in favor except for Rhode Island, which means that it failed to pass because of the smallest of states. Anyone else see a problem with this? So it's kind of an editorial kind of idea. And of course, did that actually happen? No, it didn't happen. But it could have happened. And if it did happen, then what kind of weakness did it draw from? What kind of weakness did we see a problem with? That supermajority. Okay, that idea of needing everyone to agree in order to pass amendments. So come up with, you can use one of those, or you can use a different one, whichever weakness you want to address. But use one of those at least to try and have some type of article. And we'll go through these in class on Friday. So please make sure you have this ready to go for Friday in class, and start getting ready for your test next Tuesday. All right, I think that's all for today. See you later.